You know, I used to not like anime. When I was a young lad of about 9 or 10, I walked into the living room of my childhood boat to see that my brother was watching some of the initial episodes of Attack on Titan. And I was curious. So, after making what was presumably the healthiest meal to ever grace this earth, I sat down next to him and began watching. I observed this show's wondrous animation, its smooth action scenes and compelling scenarios. And then I actually saw one of the titular titans, and I got so grossed out that I came to the conclusion there and then that I didn't watch, nor did I like anime. And so, life went on. I consumed animation in the form of Ben 10 and Teen Titans, and basically anything that was on Cartoon Network in the 2010s. As I got older, my tastes evolved. I became refined. I went back to watch some of the classics, such as Batman the Animated Series and that one Spider-Man show from the 60s.
Quick, when he swings down, throw the vibrator at it. What?
So a couple months ago, I was yet again in my living room with my brother when he put on Solo Leveling, to which I lightly objected, citing once again that I do not like anime. Anyway, I really like Solo Leveling. I think it's good. Anime is notably quite different from Western animation, especially in the way it tells its stories. It's less of a window into the objective going-ons of a person or group of people, and more of a case of being placed into a scenario in which you are allowed to look through the eyes of certain characters in certain moments. For example, Western animation will usually show you an event happening in real time, whereas anime might subtly slow down time and deliver monologues of the character's thoughts. And if there are two characters in a scene, sometimes they might even sync up. Wow, telepathy. But even visually, there is a very clear and distinct difference between Western animation and anime. Anime is sharper, messier, more colorful. Western animation is rounder, tidier. They kind of look like they filmed it on an in-universe camera and then just didn't color grade it. Some do actually think that anime might even just look better. That could be why we have shows like Avatar: The Last Airbender and My Adventures with Superman that take heavy inspiration for their art styles from the East. Which brings me to today's question. How did we get here? Which Japanese person decided to make an art style change so prolific that it's resonated throughout an entire medium? And why did they do that? Are you sitting comfortably? Good, then let's begin. Because we are going to be here a while. Remember when I said in the last video that this was going to come out on the 19th? Haha, me neither. If you were to compare a Disney movie and an anime, you may notice a slight difference. That being that they look nothing alike. This could be for any number of reasons, and in order to figure out said reasons, I would like to go back. Very far back. So, how did animation art styles get started in the first place? Well, the first ever known means of animation is from the Shari Sukata... I definitely butchered that. Archaeological site in Iran. The bowl dates back to 3178 BC, and works by spinning it rather quickly, and focusing your eyes on the images on the side of the bowl to create the illusion of movement. And then nobody innovated for 2,000 years. Anyway, during the first millennium BCE, someone in Central Asia decided to invent shadow puppetry, which is this really cool, simple means of projection where you just shine a light source onto some cloth and manually animate some paper cutouts to create stories. This became widespread rather quickly as a means of entertainment. And then nobody innovated for 2,000 years. 1000 AD was around the time of the premiere of the revolving lantern, which was a device that essentially automated shadow puppetry by rotating multiple cutouts around a light source. And then, just like shadow puppetry, the shapes of these cutouts would then be projected onto thin sheets of paper. Luckily, we don't have to wait another 2 millennia for the next innovation in animation. Because at some point in the 1600s, some fella realized that replacing the cutouts in shadow puppetry with stained glass panels would provide some color for your projections. And so, the magic lantern was born. Granted, nobody had yet figured out how to get these glass panels to move properly, but that didn't stop the magic lantern from becoming widespread, even making its way to Japan in the 1850s, by means of an enforced treaty with America in order to prevent the colonization of Japan. The magic lantern also became quite popular amongst the artists of the Phantasmagoria, which is just such a Victorian name for what is essentially a horror show. Sometimes I wish I lived in Victorian times. Actually, wait, no I don't. I probably have been poor and racist. Then finally, the 1800s saw massive developments in the realm of animation. And most other things, to be honest. In 1827, the thaumatrope, a toy which would combine two images on either side of a disc by means of the user simply spinning it fast enough, caused people to realize that the human eye actually maintains an image of everything it sees for a few moments after it stops seeing it. Meaning that if you were to, I don't know, show someone a bunch of images in quick succession, they might perceive that as smooth motion. So now, armed with this knowledge, everyone lost their collective minds, starting with one Joseph Plateau, who would invent the phenakistoscope, which was a wheel that when spun would create the illusion of movement when you focused on the images around the side of the device. Finally, Victorian-era technology has caught up to the 5,000-year-old pottery. Time is so awesome. Anyway, after this, somebody decided to raise the edges of the phenakistoscope and put some slits in some paper to invent the zoetrope. Then somebody literally just put a mirror in the middle of the zoetrope and called it a praxinoscope. Nice work, Charles Emile Raynaud. It was at this point that Raynaud came up with the actually quite brilliant idea to get a praxinoscope and a magic lantern and just kind of like smash them together until he invents cartoons. He did this in 1888, by the way, meaning that cartoons actually predate The Scary Train by 8 years. Raynaud's system was called the optical theater, and it worked by having images rotate through a magic lantern, which would then be projected onto a surface. The only problem with this system in concept was that the praxinoscope was a wheel, and as such could only animate repetitive movements, as any animation would need to loop back to the beginning by the time the praxinoscope had finished a 360 degrees rotation. But Raynaud had a solution to this. He figured out that if you simply extended the praxinoscope into a strip, then you could animate any movement, and swap out strips when you wanted to animate new movements. Yeah, he didn't know this at the time, but he had basically just invented film reel. And so the optical theater became a rather popular attraction for many old-timey novelty enthusiasts. And Raynaud enjoyed a great deal of success until about 1896. You'll never guess what happened in 1896. Yeah, it was the Scary Train. So the invention of the cinematograph kind of killed pure animation for a little bit. That's fun. I am kind of exaggerating. Most people just focused on VFX work for like the next 11 years. Some of this early work could be considered animation, and is important, especially stop motion, but none of it's particularly relevant to this video, which, if you don't remember, is about anime. So in terms of relevance to this video, stop motion is only really considered important for its mere existence, because it created the idea that you could get inanimate objects to look like they were moving. And so the question was posed, what if we did stop motion, but to a flip book? Well, people thought it prudent to find out. In France, of all places, Emile Cole is credited as creating the first ever purely animated cartoon in 1907, and it looks alright. The style certainly exists. So I suppose we've now answered the question of how art style simply came to be. However, my prerogative now is to probably talk about the thing that's in the title of this video. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, like 10 minutes into this video, we're going to Japan. In the same year Emile Cole proved that pure animation was both possible and viable, another director, Oten Shimakawa, created Katsudo Shashin. It's unfortunate that we only have a few seconds of footage of this animation, but even so, it still seems to look miles better than what was happening here in the West. This very brief clip already shows a clear sense of style and realism that you just don't get from Cole's stick figures. That's not to discount his work, it's just that Japan appears to have immediately outclassed him. Katsudo Shashin was followed by other Japanese animations, such as The Dull Sword in 1917 and Urashimo Taro in 1918. By this point, Western animation had caught up technically, and was starting to produce better pieces with more personality, like Gertie the Dinosaur. As time would pass, the massive quality gap between the two would become more and more apparent, although that wouldn't stop Japan from forming a whole animation industry of its own over the years. But just as they were getting started, God decided that now would be a good time to cause some pain and suffering. In 1923, the Great Kanto earthquake caused the beginnings of Japan's animation to almost be wiped from the earth. But that's not all it did, because it also had a magnitude of 8.1 and killed about 124,093 people. It would be an understatement to say that this earthquake was just pretty big. It devastated Tokyo. Once Japan recovered, however, they continued to produce their own in-house animations for the purposes of showing them in Japanese theaters. Speaking of Japanese theaters, they had these positions held by what were known as the benshi, who would narrate over films and animated shorts in place of the sound that didn't exist at the time. You would think by around 1928, which is when Steamboat Willie was released, and synced sound cartoons were proven to be possible, the benshi would start to be phased out. But no, and this is actually kind of sweet, they were so beloved by the Japanese public that they were considered a cultural icon, and as such continued to narrate their hearts out until the late 30s, being given about 10 years of leniency. Many would go on to become voice actors after having their previous job rendered kind of redundant. Speaking of the 30s, 1933 saw the first ever sci-fi anime in A Day After 100 Years, which would go on to be the birth of a very storied sci-fi anime history. Japanese animation mostly remained in the same technical state for the next few years, despite the West having vastly superior technique and style, to the point where Mickey Mouse was considered something of a representative of America, which naturally led to the Japanese-produced Marbo's Big Race, in which Mickey Mouse and Betty Boop cheer on Marbo, a Japanese contestant in the 1936 Berlin Olympics. Wow, that's gonna age really well in about 4 years. 1937 did see Japan's first ever full-color animation entitled Princess Katsura, which was more of a technical showcase than anything else, as color did not catch on in Japan. By the way, did you know that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1940? It was probably the worst decision they could have possibly made. After declaring war on America, the Japanese government started mandating that all animation should be pro-Japan and anti-America, which naturally led to people producing animated shorts in which Japanese folk heroes beat up Mickey Mouse. History is too stupid to have actually happened. The Japanese animation industry, in desperate need of mascots, turned to manga for inspiration and adaptation. And now I'm going to explain what manga is. In 1902, Rakuten Kitazawa published the first modern manga, which was a collection of illustrated images that told a story using art and speech bubbles that would contain dialogue. During World War II, one manga in particular, The Black Dog, was rather popular. After adapting the character into animated propaganda, the Black Dog became highly merchandised, which would be the start of quite a fond pastime of the anime industry. I suppose slightly in the spirit of being at war, Japan began to fund the development of animation as a technical art, mostly so they could produce higher quality propaganda, but also so they could beat the Americans in the realm of animation quality and technical skill. All of this culminated in 1943's Momotaro's Sea Eagles, which was marketed as being Japan's first ever feature-length animated film. It was not. It was 37 minutes long. Which is close, but feature length means 40 to 60 minutes or longer, and has since 1906, which is why they made a sequel. Momotaro Sacred Sailors is quite simply landmark animation for Japan. It has such fluid animation, such a sense of style, and is also extremely problematic. The film actually sees Japan winning the war, which in 1945 must have been quite the optimistic prediction. Sacred Sailors was directed by Seo Mitsuyo, who had been working in the animation industry for a while up to that point. Due to a significant lack of men around due to the largest global conflict to date being right there, Seo made this while significantly understaffed. His solution? Women, obviously. Although, I would like you to keep in mind that women at this time weren't exactly running the workforce, so a lot of the new staff had to be trained up and start work in under a month. I cannot stress how much this production went through just to get the film made, let alone have it both catch up and in some places surpass Western animation in quality. I mean, wow. They must have been so annoyed when they lost the war.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
Have you ever heard the phrase, nobody ever truly wins a war? Yeah, I'd like to push back on that. Countries that have just won a war definitely do not look like Japan after World War II. The country was thrown into a state of crisis. They'd been nuked twice, and everyone who remained was almost guaranteed to live in abject poverty for about the next 5-ish years. Naturally, work was a bit slow for animators. In fact, no animations were produced at all until a year after the war was over. Cherry Blossom was a solemn and somewhat melancholic art piece that was supposed to encourage the Japanese public to move forward in whatever way they could. Now, being under American occupation, most animated films seen by the public of the time were imported from America, and even animation that was produced in-house usually co-opted Western stylings. It wasn't until 1948 that Japan would begin to reforge an identity of its own in the realm of cartoons. Now might be a good time to mention Toho Studios. They're a film studio who have been involved in many anime productions over the years. but in 1948, they were in the middle of a series of well-deserved, if extremely brutal strikes. Toho Studios were notorious for underpaying their staff, and after catching wind of the latest series of layoffs, staff actually decided to barricade themselves inside the building. Anyway, they also released Tora and the Bride, which was perhaps the first of many animations to pave the way for the version of anime that we know today. Its animation was fluid, expressive, and at times absolutely jaw-dropping. This shot where the camera rotates is difficult to do well today and would usually be done using CGI, so pulling it off at the time is beyond impressive. Honestly, it should have been impossible. And then, after 195 days, the Japanese and American governments decided to send in the army to extract the staff from the Toho Studios building. Tora and the Bride would receive a solid sequel in 1950, called Tora the Ship Sweeper, although it wouldn't be anywhere near as groundbreaking. Going into the 1950s, there were some developments on the side of manga, those being the popularization of manga shonen and manga shoujo respectively, which just means manga boy and manga girl. Creative naming system, well done to whoever came up with that one. Osamu Tezuka also entered the picture. Our good friend Oz here thought it prudent to start producing some of the best known manga of all time, while also just changing the way that art was drawn in manga. He had this very cinematic way of drawing panels which had never been seen up to that point. His breakout hit was called New Treasure Island, but he also made a little known manga called Astro Boy. I'm sure that won't be important later. Not unless, I don't know, TVs saw mass adoption in the 50s in Japan or something, but like, no, that would never happen. Television technology had been around in Japan since the 1920s, but considering the cost of making and or owning one, not to mention the rather large war that just happened, nobody really cared. But by the 50s, prices began to drop, and the technology infrastructure was being put in place to allow a fairly large portion of the population to start watching telly. Now in the beginning, animation on TV was mostly regulated to imported media, such as Jim and Judy and Manga Superman, which was literally just Superman. Okay, guys, we are aware that we can come up with words in Japan that aren't just sticking the word manga in front of a pre-existing word. We are aware of this, right? Good, because the next person I see doing this is getting death noted. Japanese animators did start to see a steady stream of work in the form of adverts, which now looked brilliant thanks to a newly recovered Japanese economy, allowing for animators to have a fairly large number of resources. The first animated advertisement was aired in 1953, and was an ad for some clocks or something. Outside of adverts, Japan was still animating shorts, with the preferred style of the decade being that of stop motion. However, one animation studio decided to make a hard reset back to 2D, and touting themselves as the Disney of Japan, a newly formed Toei Animation released Kitten Graffiti in 1957. They would go on to release more animations and even a number of feature-length films over the next few years, becoming Japan's largest animation studio, even making Magic Boy in 1959, which while not being all too impressive on its own, did see a young Hayao Miyazaki join the studio. Other notable thing that happened in 1959, you remember that manga from earlier? You know, the one I said wasn't important? Well, now it's been adapted into a show. So I lied, it actually was important. Mind you, Astro Boy looks a little strange. At this point in time, anime was seriously looking for an identity. It had evolved out of its infancy and tried to copy what was going on in the West, and now it was doing nothing but trying to be unique. 1960 would see fashion, and 1961 would see the release of There and Here. Both were rather avant-garde animations, which were cool, granted, but they didn't really have the widespread appeal that the Japanese animation industry was looking for. Western animation at this point was starting to look more like Scooby-Doo and the Jetsons, as limited animation became a cheaper and easier way of creating cartoons. Mushi Production would find themselves at the pinnacle of this dilemma, and their solution would forever shape pretty much all of Japanese animation that came after it. They had the bright idea to adapt a manga, one with simple designs that could easily be animated using limited animation techniques, as a result lending itself to fluid animation and action scenes when necessary. And then, probably the biggest contributing factor to this anime's success would be that this manga would be adapted into a full-length animated TV show. Now, any manga they picked would have probably become the face of Japanese animation art styles for a while, but considering that Osamu Tezuka was one of the higher-ups at Mushi at the time, the choice was obvious. And as such, Astro Boy began airing in 1963. Now it's important to understand why it is that Astro Boy looks as good as it does. This video is about art styles after all. Well, to start, the show is extremely stylized, which means that nobody on the animation staff ever had to worry about anatomy or correct proportions, which was a massive time saver. Not to mention how simple these fellas looked, which made it rather simple to move them around the screen. Especially the main character. Astro Boy himself only really has detailings around his joints, which means that he can be rapidly drawn and made to look very kinetic very quickly. The main appeal of this design, however, is the eyes. They are big, massive in fact. For some perspective, in real life, the size of the human eyeball is usually comparable to about the size of your nose. Comparing Astro Boy's eyeball to his nose is like comparing a basketball to a pebble. This gives the character's face a lot more expressive potential, and means that it's easier for audiences to connect with this quite obviously not real guy, as opposed to some of Hanna-Barbera's slightly more obviously not real guys. As far as the industry at the time was concerned, Astro Boy would kind of change the game, at least in Japan. Whereas before, Japanese animators were looking for their X factor, their style, as it were, now everyone was scrambling to copy Astro Boy. Tezuka's style became the face of anime, and from this point on, innovation was usually seen in the evolution of this style. Starting with another Mushi production anime, Kimba the White Lion was one of Japan's first full-color anime TV shows. This one was worked on without the aid of Tezuka, as he became notoriously difficult to work with. The core techniques were carried over from Astro Boy, but the backgrounds became painted vistas full of vibrant color. As a result, they had a habit of looking much more dynamic than what Mushi had previously pulled off. There was also quite clearly a greater focus on movement. The animators seem to have really worked on making objects look like they were moving faster. Where anime really starts to look like anime, in my opinion, is around the time of the release of Speed Racer in 1967. This show had a much bigger focus on realistic body proportions, while also maintaining the really expressive eyes. This allowed for more realistic movement without losing the subtlety of a character's face. These are by no means the only anime at the time, by the way. I'm just picking out shows that showcase art styles at the time. Like Dororo in 1969. It was a much more adult-oriented anime, and as such employed many more cinematic techniques, especially in the way characters were lit, with harsh shadows being cast over character designs. Later, in 1971, Ashita no Joe would take this style and improve it even more, by increasing the detail in character designs by a staggering amount. This is a trend that I originally didn't like in anime, as I think these designs can look a little grotesque, but I think most anime hits the balance of detail super well. And I have also mellowed on this look over the years. Outside of the darker side of anime, however, and skipping over to 1974, Heidi, Girl of the Alps, was telling a much more light-hearted story. This would require animators to pivot the way they were expressing emotion. Due to Heidi, and other shows like it, not being concerned with action scenes, emotion started to be expressed primarily through the face and subtle body language. Going into the 80s, you can actually see quite the pivot from the very realistic approach of 70s anime. In 1981, Yuruza Yatsuro was out here having very exaggerated facial expressions, as well as hair becoming a much more prominent feature of anime character designs. I find this really entertaining to see, as well as lending itself to the expressiveness of the art form really well. What would also help with this is the variety that was afforded by shows like Macross, which came out just a year later in 1982. Throughout the 60s and 70s, you can see that everything has a very refined and rounded look to it. Macross especially pioneered this more scratchy and sharp style that looked far more adult, and worked brilliantly for a more grown first generation of anime fans. The more rounded art style wouldn't be going anywhere, however, because in 1986, Studio Ghibli would make it their trademark style when they released their first film, Castle in the Sky. This movie saw major leaps in the technical aspects of anime, looking more fluid than ever before, with crowd work and character movement being an absolute highlight. Studio Ghibli and its co-founder, Hayao Miyazaki, would go on to take the coveted spot of what was essentially the Disney of Japan, which was the exact moniker that Miyazaki's ex-employer, Toei Animation, claimed they were going to be 27 years prior. But Miyazaki wasn't the only one pushing the boundaries by the end of the 80s, because in 1988, Akira would release, which would become so much of a legend that it's still considered a must-watch today, along with Spirited Away, but that wouldn't come out for another 13 years. Akira had this much darker, grittier, cinematic look. They even got the lip sync right this time, owing to the fact that they actually recorded the voice actors' lines before animating, which while standard practice in the West is actually quite rare for anime. Akira also just has a way with character designs. Shotaro's jumpsuit, for example, is iconic, and Tetsu's cloak makes him highly recognizable. This entire production was so iconic that it's still referenced in both anime and Western animation today by means of the motorcycle slide. Anime has always been very experimental. That's why we've seen such a wide range and variations of style since its inception. But going into the 90s, and especially the late 90s, you can really start to see a more standardized look for anime. Titles like Cowboy Bebop, for example, mostly made up their art styles by combining elements from the 70s and 80s. That's not to say that no one was experimenting at this time. They definitely were, but anime become definitively anime-looking, especially to Western eyes, about here. The next big wave of experimentation, and really big shakeup for the anime industry, came in the mid to late 2000s. Digital animation was starting to allow for anime to be produced much faster and with less people, meaning that you could have much higher quality productions in general. Gurren Lagann in 2007 is a really interesting example of this, because despite the fact it is very clearly digital, having quite clearly digital lighting and backgrounds, it also maintains really sharp lines and a really scratchy and chaotic look in general, which, on digital, is something you have to do on purpose. This was a very deliberate decision. And thanks to the use of digital animation, this style is able to remain consistent throughout each episode. Digital animation has actually persisted over the last 20 years, and is still animes and Western animations' primary means of production. So I think it might now be best to take a quick look at the modern state of the anime art style, before I can finally go to sleep. A solid piece of trivia to mention at this point would be that many creators are outliers in the world of anime right now. Many styles are being quite experimental, and not everything looks like My Hero Academia. That being said, here's why most anime looks like My Hero Academia right now. Manga and anime have had a very close relationship since Astro Boy, leading all the way up to the modern day. Most anime produced today are adapted from manga, with very few exceptions, and as such, a show's style will usually just be dictated by simply the way the manga looks. And as for why manga currently looks the way it does, most of the reasons for that are to stand out on the pages of modern manga magazines. And they normally do this by using really cool looking character designs and sometimes really strange plots, which anime fans have actually come to be quite fond of. Or at least, I hope you're fond of them, otherwise I have no idea why something like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure could ever exist. Modern day anime a lot of the time also has this very cheap and simple look to it, except for when it doesn't. This is because a lot of shows today normally have a non-linear budgeting strategy, basically meaning that they dedicate a very large portion of the budget to action scenes and high-intensity moments, and leave the rest of the product to look like a slideshow that somebody hit pan and zoom on. I am making fun of this trope, but I actually think it helps the storytelling a lot to just have the animation get way better during important story beats. It's kind of like the show's way of going, no, get off your phone. Genu is about to fight a rather large insect. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that anime is necessarily better than Western animation. I am far more experienced with Western art, and have seen some absolutely stunning work in the past, but I can very much see the merits of anime and Eastern animation as a whole. I can also see why many might prefer it to the offerings that their home countries are dishing out. So maybe my opinion will change in the future, who knows. What I do know is that I am tired, and I would like to stop writing this script because it is 4:10 in the morning. So, why does anime look like that? Well, it actually turns out that it's the result of hundreds of years of very dense and layered history. Have a nice day. So it could only animate repetitive movements because it would need to rotate 360 degrees every single time it completed a rotation. So it could only animate repetitive movements as all animations would need to loop back to the beginning by the time the wheel had created So it could only animate repetitive movements as any animation would need to loop back to the beginning by the end. Murder. I'm just saying words at this point. Honestly, it doesn't feel like I'm saying a sentence. It doesn't feel like I'm saying a sentence. The only problem with this system in concept was that the praxinoscope was a wheel. Yeah. And as such, could only animate repetitive movements, as any animation would need to loop back to the beginning by the time the praxinoscope had finished a 360 degrees rotation. Yep, that's the take we're going with. That's the take we're going with. That entire sentence definitely didn't take me like 10 minutes to just say without screwing it up.